By late 1943, flying over Europe meant betting your life on statistics that were getting worse by the week. Entire bomber crews vanished in minutes, and one small mistake, one damaged system, one aircraft slipping out of formation, was often enough to seal everyone's fate. High above enemy territory, survival depended on machines working perfectly and men performing far beyond what was expected of them. This story takes place inside that fragile balance. Inside a bomber built for endurance, not mercy. Inside a crew where every role mattered, and where the failure of one could doom all the others. What happens when that system begins to collapse? When the guns fall silent, the radio goes dead, and the aircraft is left alone in hostile skies. And how much can responsibility stretch before the human body simply gives out? To see how this mission became a fight for survival, we need to go back to the path that pushed one man beyond his limits. By the end of 1943, the air war over Europe had become one of the most dangerous assignments in the U.S. military. The 8th Air Force, operating from England, was executing a strategy of daylight precision bombing aimed at destroying German industry, transportation networks, and aircraft production. These missions forced American bombers to fly deep into enemy territory, often beyond the range of fighter escort. Losses mounted rapidly. Entire crews were wiped out in minutes, and statistical survival odds dropped sharply with each completed mission. Falling out of formation almost guaranteed destruction, as isolated bombers were quickly targeted by enemy fighters and ground fire. The center of this strategy was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft was designed not for speed or agility, but for endurance and mutual defense. Bristling with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, the B-17 relied on overlapping fields of fire between aircraft flying in tight formation. Each crew member had a defined role, but combat rarely respected job descriptions. When positions were destroyed or gunners wounded, others were expected to compensate instantly. Internal coordination was critical, and the aircraft's radio system was essential not only for navigation and command, but for survival itself. A damaged radio could turn a survivable ditching into a death sentence. Within this system, the radio operator-gunner held a dual responsibility. He managed communications, monitored signals, and, during attacks, operated defensive guns from the radio compartment. Forrest Lee Woody Vossler entered this environment as a young enlisted airman with limited combat experience. He had joined the Army Air Forces in October 1942, trained as both a radio operator and aerial gunner, and was assigned to the 358th Bombardment Squadron of the 303rd Bombardment Group at RAF Molesworth, England. By December 1943, Vossler had flown only 4 combat missions. He was not yet considered a veteran by wartime standards. Despite his short service, Vossler had already demonstrated unusual composure under fire. On his first combat mission, enemy fighters damaged the aircraft's oxygen system, leaving 2 crewmates unconscious at high altitude. Vossler repaired the system mid-flight while simultaneously manning a gun to help defend the aircraft. That action saved lives and earned him the Air Medal for Valor. More importantly, it revealed a pattern. Vossler did not limit himself to assigned duties when circumstances demanded more. He responded to emergencies instinctively, prioritizing crew survival over personal safety. By December 20th, 1943, Vossler fully understood the reality of bomber warfare. He knew the statistical odds, the vulnerability of damaged aircraft, and the consequences of isolation. He also knew that once a mission went wrong, survival depended less on orders and more on individual decisions made under extreme pressure. When his B-17 lifted off toward Bremen that morning, Vossler was still early in his combat career, but he carried a clear understanding of responsibility. What remained unknown was how far that responsibility would be tested when discipline, training, and physical endurance were pushed beyond normal human limits. If you're enjoying stories like this, where discipline, training, and human endurance collide inside real historical events, consider supporting the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. because from this point forward, this mission stops being about strategy or statistics and becomes a moment-by-moment fight for survival. The mission to Bremen began before dawn on December 20th, 1943. From airfields across eastern England, nearly 500 American bombers lifted into the cold winter sky, their engines rumbling in long, staggered lines. For many crews, recent missions had suggested that German resistance might be weakening. Early December raids had faced only moderate opposition, and there was cautious optimism that this would be another hard but manageable flight. Forrest Vossler's B-17 Jersey Bounce Jr. took its place in the massive formation and turned east toward the continent, climbing to altitude as the North Sea slid beneath them. That optimism did not survive contact with enemy territory. Soon after crossing into Holland, the formation was met by overwhelming force. More than 100 German fighters rose to intercept the bombers, attacking in waves that stretched for miles. As the formation pushed deeper toward Bremen, heavy flak joined the assault, filling the sky with black bursts of steel. Vossler's crew pressed on, maintaining position, holding formation discipline that meant the difference between mutual protection and isolation. By the time bombs were released over the target, Jersey Bounce Jr. was already damaged. One engine was out, another was failing, and the aircraft was struggling to keep pace as the pilot turned west toward home. Unable to maintain speed or altitude, the bomber slipped out of formation. In the air war over Germany, this moment was often fatal. A lone B-17 became an exposed target, stripped of the overlapping firepower that formations provided. Enemy fighters immediately focused their attacks. Flak damage was compounded by repeated strafing runs, tearing into the fuselage and systems. Inside the aircraft, alarms, smoke, and shouted reports replaced any illusion of control. The crew was no longer part of an armada. They were alone. Early in the engagement, a 20mm cannon shell exploded inside the radio compartment. Shrapnel ripped into Vossler's legs and thighs, inflicting painful, bleeding wounds that would have justified immediate evacuation from his position. Blood pooled on the metal floor as the radio equipment sparked and went silent. Yet Vossler did not abandon his post. Instead, he dragged himself upright and manned the single .50 caliber machine gun at the radio hatch, adding his fire to the desperate defense of the aircraft. Fully aware that the odds had turned against them, he made a decision that would define the rest of the mission. He would stay and fight. Almost simultaneously, disaster struck the tail. A direct hit wounded the tail gunner and rendered the rear guns inoperative, the most dangerous failure a B-17 could suffer while under fighter attack. The tail was the aircraft's most vulnerable angle, the preferred approach for German fighters. With that sector exposed, destruction was only a matter of time. Recognizing the threat instantly, Vossler redirected his fire to help cover the rear. Despite his wounds, he kept up a steady stream of defensive fire, compensating for the loss of the tail guns. This was not his assigned role, but necessity overrode procedure. The aircraft's survival depended on it. The attacks did not stop. Another enemy shell exploded, this time near Vossler's face and chest. Shrapnel tore into his upper body and lodged in both of his eyes. His vision collapsed into blurred shapes and shadows, his face burning with pain. For a moment, the damage was so severe that he believed half his face had been destroyed. Even so, Vossler refused first aid. He remained at the gun, firing at shapes he could barely distinguish, guided more by instinct and training than sight. Each burst of fire was an act of defiance against the reality that his injuries should have ended his ability to fight. As the battle continued, Vossler drifted in and out of consciousness. The radio, already damaged earlier, was now completely inoperative. For the crew, this was catastrophic. Without radio contact, no distress call could be sent, no rescue coordinated if the aircraft went down. When the pilot announced that ditching in the North Sea might be the only option, the situation became even more dire. Survival after a water landing depended almost entirely on rescue speed. Without a radio signal, the crew's chances were slim. Despite near blindness and extreme blood loss, Vossler crawled back to the shattered radio. Unable to see the controls, he worked by touch alone, feeling wires, switches, and components with trembling hands. Several times he lost consciousness, only to wake and continue. Piece by piece, guided by memory and training, he restored enough function to transmit. First an SOS, then repeated distress signals, sent continuously as the bomber descended toward the sea. Each signal was a gamble against time, pain, and exhaustion. Flying at wave-top height, Jersey Bounce Jr. finally reached the North Sea. The pilot brought the crippled bomber down in a controlled ditching. The impact was violent but survivable. As water rushed in, Vossler managed to get himself out onto the wing without assistance. There he saw, or sensed, the wounded tail gunner slipping toward the edge, unconscious and helpless. Ignoring his own condition, Vossler moved across the wing and grabbed the man, anchoring himself with one hand on the aircraft's antenna wire. In freezing December water, strength and coordination should have failed. They did not. Vossler held on until other crewmen could pull the wounded gunner into the life raft. Rescue came because the distress signals had been received. A nearby vessel located the crew and pulled them from the sea. 9 men lived who would almost certainly have died without communication, defense, and sheer endurance. The mission to Bremen ended not in victory over the enemy, but in survival wrestled back from inevitability, secured by one man who refused to stop functioning when every system, including his own body, was failing. All 9 crewmen of Jersey Bounce Jr. survived the mission, but survival came at a lasting cost. Forrest Vossler's injuries were catastrophic. Shrapnel had torn through his body and lodged deep in both eyes, leaving him completely blind when he was pulled from the North Sea. He spent the next year moving between military hospitals as doctors attempted to repair damage that was considered, at first, irreversible. Eventually, they were able to restore partial vision to his left eye. His right eye, however, was permanently lost. Vossler would never fly another combat mission. The war, for him, ended not with a rotation home, but in a hospital bed. The Army Air Forces did not view his actions as a moment of luck or isolated bravery. What Vossler did was formally investigated, documented, and preserved in official records. In 1944, he was summoned to the White House, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally awarded him the Medal of Honor. The citation made one point unmistakably clear. Vossler's heroism was defined not by enemy aircraft destroyed, but by sustained action under extreme physical collapse. Blinded, wounded, and repeatedly losing consciousness, he continued to fight, repair, transmit, and protect others long after normal human limits had been exceeded. These actions were classified as above and beyond the call of duty, the highest standard the military recognizes. After the war, Vossler returned quietly to civilian life. He worked in radio engineering, pursued education when his injuries allowed, and eventually dedicated decades of his career to the Veterans Administration, helping other wounded servicemen navigate life after combat. Public recognition was never his focus. His story endured not because he told it, but because the men he saved survived to confirm it, and because the military record left no room for exaggeration. In the end, this was not a story about firepower, kill counts, or aerial victory. It was about discipline, responsibility, and refusal. One man, nearly blind and bleeding, chose not to stop functioning when stopping would have been understandable. And in doing so, he altered the fate of an entire crew, raising a final question that still echoes. How many lives are changed not by winning, but by one person deciding that giving up is not an option?